Everyone. This is the first event of the Desecuritizing Muslim Identity lecture series that is hosted by the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And we are thrilled today to start our lecture series with someone who I personally respect so much as an academic, as a humanist, as a Muslim leader, both an international leader whose research and scholarship has an impact both in the US, but also in the Middle East. And before I introduce Dr. Abdullahi and Naim, I want to first tell you a little bit more about the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, and encourage you to attend all of our events and hopefully be a supporter in the long run. So the Center for Security, Race, and Rights is the first civil rights center at a US law school that focuses disproportionately or primarily on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities' civil rights and human rights. We do so through a transnational approach, through a cross-racial approach, and through an interfaith approach, because we appreciate that you cannot understand civil and human rights without understanding what happens internationally and also what happens to other minority communities, because oftentimes the structures and the systems that produce adverse impacts, if not outright discrimination against one particular minority community, tend to be the same systems and structures, even if the discrimination or the rights violations may manifest in different ways. So I will also put a plug in for our social media, which is where you can continue to learn more about these issues. We are on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR. We are on Twitter at RUCSRR. We are on Facebook at RUCSRR, and we are also on TikTok at RUCSRR. So we're trying to cover every generation of people who follow social media. And then our website is csrr.rutgers.edu, and you can join our newsletter from there. Now, we are very fortunate to have CLE credit available for the lawyers who that is something that they're required to do. So if you registered for CLE credit at rutgerscle.com, a code will be typed in the chat and read out loud around the middle of the program. Write down the code, which you need to include in the CLE form and evaluation, which will be provided through a link in the chat at the conclusion of the program. CLE credit in New Jersey is 1.2 for diversity. In New York, it's 1.0 for diversity or ethics. And in Pennsylvania, it's 1.0 for ethics. If applicable, New Jersey and New York CLE certificates will be emailed to you or reported to Pennsylvania. And again, if you haven't had a chance, you can register right now before we start the program at rutgerscle.com. Okay, so with that, I am delighted, thrilled, honored, and privileged to introduce our keynote speaker today. And again, in the initiation of our Desecuritizing Muslim Identity. So Dr. Abdullahi Ahmed and Naim is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Law at Emory Law School, Associated Professor in the Emory College of Arts and Sciences, and Senior Fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion of Emory University. An internationally recognized scholar of Islam and human rights and cross-cultural perspectives, Dr. Naim teaches courses in international law, comparative law, human rights, and Islamic law. His research interests include constitutionalism in Islamic and African countries, secularism, and Islam and politics. Dr. Naim has directed research projects which focus on advocacy strategies for reform through internal transformation. His current research projects include a study of Muslim and the secular state and of human rights from state-centric to people-centered approaches. And I would, again, be remiss not to mention how influential Dr. Naim has been through his long and prolific career as a scholar and an advocate. And Dr. Naim is exactly the type of person that all Americans should be listening to and reading his work if they want to understand Islamic law, if they want to understand jihad, if they want to understand women's rights, if they want to understand democracy in Muslim majority countries. Because unfortunately, what we have are pundits and Islamophobes and people who have absolutely no objective qualifications that talk about Islam, slander Muslims. And as a result, we have very serious and real civil rights violations against Muslims. So what we are doing today in this lecture series is offering you an expert, someone who has committed his life's work to understanding these very important issues, in hopes that it's people like Dr. Naeem that you should go to in terms of resources to understand these, to understand Islam and Muslims and all of the various issues that are on the front lines of newspapers in the US and especially in other Western countries. So without further ado, I will now cede the virtual floor to Dr. Naeem. Welcome, Dr. Naeem, and we so look forward to your insights.
Thank you so much. I'm trying to get settled here. Okay. Good morning, I should say, or good afternoon. It's about noon, I think, in our part of the world. But also, Assalamu alaikum is our greeting. So I will use it all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. And that doesn't make me a jihadist or a fundamentalist, just to say that. And that is very much a part of the underlying tension that I sense in this presentation, and others have been talking about these issues for the last 20 years at least in the US. So the point I'm trying to bring to our attention is that there is a socio-political, historical understanding of everything, that nothing is free of history, nothing is free of culture, actually. Nothing is free of conflicts and power relations and so on. So to understand the scripture of any of the scriptural religions, which is the three Abrahamic religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, for all these three, they are very developed and highly articulated scriptural sources that people use. But what I sense and regret in the Muslim context, in the post-colonial Muslim context, which is what I'll be focusing on, is that we tend to exaggerate and tend to take things for granted so much that we assume that whatever we see is the only way that you can see. And that's exactly what we need to repudiate. And that has been my life's work, I think, since the 1960s. Just simply to make the point that every view is someone's view. That there is no view that is abstract and suspending in virtual space. It is always people who speak, and it's always people who act, and it is people who present their understanding of their religion, of their culture, of their values to the rest of the world. So if there is a misunderstanding, we have to start by our failure to communicate clearly and effectively, and then move on to see what else is there. And again, I'm not naive as to think that the so-called level playing field, that Muslims, like everybody else, has equal access to a level playing field. That is not true. And actually, it is not true of anybody. Whoever you are, whatever you think, your own power position in your own environment or elsewhere, it's all shaped by what else is going on. History, I think, is a major factor that we tend to overlook. In my sense of this, because by the way, I was working on this until last week or a few days ago, because I was finishing a book manuscript. I call it Decolonizing Human Rights. And of course, people are shocked. And what do you mean decolonize? Yes, that human rights is as colonized as any valuable, moral, ethical discourse that can bring political advantage to some actors. So it is not the fault of human rights that it is it has to be clarified in this way, but it is our fault, our responsibility to make sure that the concept of, I use three C's to describe what I'm talking about. I would say the concept of human rights, the content of that concept, and the context in which the content is expected to be played out. So that it is not really just simply a ready-made, self-evident notion. It's a notion that is humanly constructed, and that as such, it has to be understood and practiced. And in fact, I believe that the best way to promote human rights is to practice, not to talk about it, not to study. Because the study is going to be somewhat entangled into all sorts of issues and agenda and cultural or geopolitical as well as academic sort of limitations. Uh, so the title Post-Colonial seem to suggest that there is a colonial period that is over now and that we are going into the post-colonial. Actually, I regret having to communicate this sense because that is not just simply true. It is true that the phase of colonialism is over, but it is not true that all colonialisms are over. In fact, with all due respect, the United States is just emerging out of a colonial involvement in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. When you send nearly 500,000 of your troops and all the tanks and all the drones and all the technology that goes into it, and you occupy a country for 20 years, what do you call it if it is not colonialism? But it is not the sort of colonialism that the British or the Belgians engaged in the early 20th century, but the principle is the same, although the practice is opportunistic and might take one form or another. So therefore, the point about human rights for me is that it provides us with a shared framework within which we can at least know where we are. You know, if you can imagine flying in midair or in the high seas without any types of point of departure or point of any of those markers that help us negotiate, you wouldn't know where you are and what you are talking about much. So I would like to say that I am using the term human rights to emphasize that there is a specific vision that drives our understanding of human rights. But that vision is played out in relation to each of us according to our own experiences, according to our own history. Uh, I think that the point for me is that, of course, I mean, the term has to come up soon, and let me start it as well already. Sharia. The term Sharia is taken almost synonymous with Islam, as if that this is part of Islam that has always been there and that has always been cast in these very specific terms. Nothing is further from the truth. Sharia is a secular phenomenon. It is a personal phenomenon. It's a human understanding of whatever principle or scripture that you are talking about. So by definition, it is not divine, it is not eternal, and it is all open to contestation and has been and continues to be. That's for those who care to look. There are tremendous differences in Muslims' understanding of their own faith in relation to all sorts of parameters and dimensions and so on. In Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in Central Asia. Now, Central Asia has suddenly come to our attention recently, but Central Asia has been part of the Islamic experience from the very beginning. The highest ranking scholars of Islamic jurisprudence and Islamic sources of jurisprudence are from that region. People like Bukhari, who's a master in the field of hadith of the Prophet. Bukhari is from Bukhara, which is a town in Uzbekistan at this point. So I love to discover for myself and to talk about that dimension because I have traveled there and I have seen how really subtle and profound our differences are and our similarities are, and that how unfair and impoverishing to take us all as if as just simply one lot. You know, you say Islam, and people immediately think of Saudi Arabia, think of Iran. Why? Just to get a sense of perspective here. Often it's conceded that Indonesia is the largest number of Muslim citizens, but that may be true, but of course with very different understanding of what Islam is among the people of Muslims of Indonesia. But if you look then who is second and third, it is India and Pakistan. Both these, and in fact, there are more Muslims in the Indian subcontinent than there are Muslims in the entire Middle East. And yet the Middle East is taken to define what Islam is, and the dimension of an intellectual history and vigor of understanding and practice of Islam in the Indian subcontinent is not being taken seriously. So it is we have to add this element. The second element I would like to also bring it to our attention is that whatever happens to Muslims and their lands happens to everybody else are probably at the same time. So it is not unique, it is not exceptional. That it's not as if, like Americans who tend to think that everything they do is exceptional, everything they do, anybody else does is just trying to imitate them and not quite to getting it right. No, with all due respect, we don't care to become American in every respect. For those who are American citizens, by all means, in our citizenship, we are, but in nothing else. And by the way, also, if you look at the only element that unites all Americans is citizenship, nothing else. Not race, not color, not religion, not ideology, not economy and capitalism. None of that defines who is an American. Only just simply the fact that one is a citizen of the United States. And if you wish to look further into this, I published a book in 2014. It's called What is an American Muslim? In which I try to explain and argue that American Muslim is just an American who happens to be Muslim. Just like a Catholic who happens to be American, and so on. So it is not a defining feature of being Muslim in either sense. Neither do Americans have to be Muslims or Muslims have to be American. The point is important, I think, because in the logic of this, the word I find difficult in pronouncing, from security, I know, it is help. What's the title of the program?
Securitizing Muslim identity.
Okay, it is this secularizing or desecularizing Muslim identity that I'm referring to here. That it doesn't have to be, and it has not been for thousands of years. So, it's not as if these religious experiences and cultures and values and traditions have suddenly come out of the blue to organize in order to bomb here or to fly planes into that building and so on. Muslims have been Muslims for the last 1400 years. No, not the same Muslims, of course, live that long. But the point is that Islam is not a new or alien or different phenomena that we have to somehow adjust and accept. It is a religious tradition in its own terms. It's a cultural, intellectual, artistic, and every aspect of human endeavor for itself and so on. So that's also a factor that I would like to bring. I think that the most spectacular success of colonialism is that they have transformed certain aspects of our experiences, whoever we are. I mean, this is not only to Muslims, but all colonized peoples, indigenous African religions and culture, Scandinavian, whoever that you care to look at, that they came to be shaped and embedded in with the power of colonialism and liberal ideology. And by the way, again, here, just in case I miss it later on, there is, if you notice, there is an implicit tension I keep referring to about the notion of universality of human rights, that human rights are universal. That is what the concept is. If we're not talking about universal rights, we are not talking about human rights. And for that, I would like to very much remind us all that refugees are in fact the most ideal, or if you can call it that, or the most needy of the protection of human rights, because they lack protection of everybody else. So refugees are not the high-flying political elites who travel from here to there in order to be acknowledged and set up for the next presidency or primership in the place. But it is people who really have to leave their country literally, not even have a chance to pick up a cup of water on the way out. And on that, we see that Africans probably represent, unfortunately, one of the highest, if not the highest, rate of immigration through, or rather, refugee status through flight out of war reasons. You'll find easily 2 million people there, 3 million people there, and so on, who stay there for decades in need of recognition and respect. And for the rest of the world to claim that we owe allegiance to human rights is really such a hypocritical claim, because we are not willing to do what it takes to acknowledge the value and the nature and the essence of what human rights are about, which is they are the rights of every human being by virtue of being human. So if a right to education, or if a right to uh, political participation, if whatever it is that's acknowledged to anybody, it should be acknowledged to everybody. If we are not at that stage and level of commitment, then we should not pretend to be human rights advocates. And I can keep sort of raising issues and examples that we are all probably familiar with, but I'm happy to revisit any of these issues when we come to the discussion stage and so on. So in relation to what citizenship entails, and maybe I should also note this point, that this civil rights and human rights are not synonymous. And this is a very significant point to make, especially in a country like the United States. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, at least that I have lived in this country and have read about it before I came here, which is the idea that we tend to say that we don't need human rights because we have civil rights. Actually, with all due respect, you don't have civil rights. You don't have the quality and the protection and the respect and the human dignity of people who have their civil rights protected. They are associated with the state. It is the state which grants civil rights. Of course, it's people's struggle that make the state do that, but ultimately, if the state does not do it, it does not happen. And you can only think of Texas today to realize how much of our so-called civil rights we can lose by just simply the election of the wrong governor. I say wrong governor, by the way. And I don't shy away from political implications, because politics is life, is everywhere. So I make no apology or regret for speaking politically openly. I mean, it is too serious. The issues are too fundamental and urgent for us to be sort of being diplomatic or sort of subtle about this and the other and so on. So therefore, the question of accountability has to be addressed to accountability for any human rights violations. And refugees are the most in need of that. And yet we find that Europe, we have seen it recently, and the United States have seen it for a long time, since for probably a century or more, that there is a very strong bias against refugees, as if they are from an alien planet. And of course, they do call them aliens. That's not an accident. I mean, you're definitely alien can mean politically exiled, but it has other connotations too. The point, therefore, is that human rights are the rights of the human. If we do not protect them, then we are not being true to our commitment. But let me elaborate a little bit on this point. I hope I'm not sort of tied on time, but I think my friend will let me know if I need to be careful about that. The question is that the United States, I'm really sorry to have to say this, and by the way, I did not accept this invitation to speak to people about things people accept already or are familiar with. I'm here to upset you, but not to offend you, you might say, in the sense that I don't mean to offend, but I would be delighted to know that I have upset some people to think more carefully about what they say and what they do. The United States has one of the poorest human rights record in the world. And this is not just simply talk, it's actually documented. And in some of the articles that you may have been able to download from my website, you'll see many examples to this. And this is, by the way, it is absolutely stunning that the United States managed to introduce these reservations on international human rights treaties as to make the treaty and its content utterly redundant. There is no value because there is no content. Because when the United States enter its reservations, how many treaties has it ratified? Civil and Political Rights Covenant, the Torture Convention, and maybe genocide also 40 years later. And then you see, and you read closely, and you see that in fact, the United States is renouncing and sort of stepping back from any commitment to protect human rights under the treaties, the few treaties that is willing to ratify. And yet, and here comes what I call the supreme hypocrisy of the United States, that the United States is the only country in the world, of course, because they have the means and they have the global presence to produce constant reports of human rights performance by every single nation in the world except itself. That we do not find the United States recording and acknowledging its own violations of human rights, but it's willing and keen to produce actually an annual report, global annual report on the human rights performance, quote unquote, of the rest of the world. Who gives you the right to do that? And how can you do it with a straight face when you are not willing to apply the same standards to yourself? I say this, as I said, in order to hopefully to urge you, to plead with you, please take human rights seriously and take the actions of your own government seriously. And if you do not do that, then you are not entitled. Really, I mean, just simply common sense. People may nod their head when you talk about human rights, but they don't take it seriously when you are not willing to challenge your own government about that attitude, and so on. So I should maybe going on a little bit further to say that the idea of decolonizing, and I will close with that. The title actually in my book is Decolonizing, but I noticed that the title in your project is whatever that other word is, securitizing or desecuritizing. So of course, I mean that we would like to have our ability to speak freely, to act freely, to travel freely. It is human that we do that. And for the vast majority of human beings' time on this planet has been that they enjoyed those freedoms. They did not enjoy them through legality, but through probably more profound ways of social consciousness and political action. That instead of expecting the state to acknowledge and to regulate the protection of human rights, which, by the way, of course, immediately denies the same norms of the quality of being human rights. Because if the state is the entity that claims to identify what human rights are and claims to protect those rights, then the outcome is not a human rights outcome. It may be a very high standard of quality of civil rights outcome, but it is not, because it is not the rights of every human. It is the right only of people which the United States or Canada or Sweden or Britain, any country, elected to identify and to respect, not that they are the right of every human being everywhere in the world. And that's why we see it now. We see, I mean, the number, there is a very excellent, very profound and superb project out of Brown University. It's called The Cost of War, which I think is produced by the Waston Institute. In their website, you find tremendously accurate and massive and impressive and oppressive information. I mean, about the number 39 million refugees who are out of their homes because of the conflicts that we engage in, hundreds of thousands of people killed in our sort of attempt to dominate this country or to exploit that country. And so I recommend it to you highly. I mean, The Cost of War, it's called. And the point I'm making simply is that the facts are right there looking us in the face. What is lacking is our moral acknowledgement of those facts and our willingness and commitment to act, and or at least to stand aside if you are not willing to act. Don't crowd the stage by claiming to be a human rights advocate or an advocate of a citizen of a country that respects human rights, if that is not the case, if that's not true. Ask yourself that and see where it takes you. So I'll conclude by saying that the point of these remarks, I understand that time's short and I have to limit it, but I'm happy to. I have a website, by the way, in which I have more than 70 articles and book chapters, which are available for download and printing anywhere. And they have been downloaded and printed everywhere for the last 20, 25 years, since I have been at Embry Law School. And the point for me is that whatever it is that I want to put out there, I would rather have people reject and refuse to accept what I'm saying than my not knowing whether they do or not. So in that sense, I'm urging you. I know this is a very unusual probably presentation, but it is one that have lived with the humiliation and agony of watching human rights experiences and practices very close at hand, and trying to make some sense of it and trying to make some way of protecting or contributing to protecting these rights. But I know that I and many who are like me have this commitment are a long way from where we need to be. But we are never enough in numbers or in resources. So just join, whatever it is that you care for. And let us see where it takes us. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Naim. We will give you a virtual hand of applause. So I'll encourage all the attendees to write your questions in the Q&A section. There's also a chat. It's ideal if it's in the Q&A, but there are multiple options. And while attendees are asking or typing their questions, I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to ask a few. I recently read one of your many wonderful articles called "The Spirit of Laws is Not Universal: Alternatives to the Enforcement Paradigm for Human Rights." It was published in the Tilburg Law Review in 2016. And from that, I gleaned some really interesting and provocative arguments that you made. And I was hoping perhaps you could elaborate on a few of them while we have you here. So you essentially argue that state-centric legality contradicts universality, right, which is a fundamental tenet of international human rights law, because there are, as you say, other types of normativity, and that European states presume state-centric legality is imperative for the realization of the so-called public good in all human societies, and they do this by imperial fiat. So that begs the question, what you offer something called a people-centered, right, human rights paradigm. Can you elaborate on that and explain to us what you envision in a people-centered human rights paradigm? And then also how that would apply to Muslim majority countries who, as you know, I believe all of them, with perhaps a few exceptions, have been colonized by a European nation.
Okay, thank you. By the notion of universality being undermined by legality, is that legality is relative to the state, is relative to the society. So by definition, a legal term is not a universal term. It is a term that has been developed in a particular culture, particular conditions to which in those people's mind and experience is worth protecting. The term right itself is a liberal term. It is not a universal term. So when you say human rights are universal, there is a contradiction in the phrase itself. How can they be rights and universal? What I'm proposing is that to build a consciousness, a commitment to values that is shared among societies, which protect these rights, not by state legality, but by the practice of people. That's how we raise our children, how we treat our spouses, of course, usually men and women, how we deal with our next door neighbor who could be of a different religion or a different ethnicity. Those are the questions to ask. It is not how many treaties that we have ratified, because ratification of treaties, and I'm sorry to say this, does zero for the protection of human rights. Nothing happens. The whole process is a process about so-called naming and shaming, that certain countries or governments are should be named for the human rights violations they commit. It starts at home, and then you can see that how far that will take you. Where is the rights of the child in the United States as a treaty that's binding? The only treaty that is recognized and ratified by every single country in the world except the United States. And when the United States refused to ratify, it claims that it is protecting its own cultural values and its own tradition. So that's what everybody else claims to be, whether it's China or Iran or whoever you like to take as your typical US protagonist, you'll see that they too have a claim to that this is our culture. Now, the point, of course, obviously, how can we have universal rights when you have such cultural diversity and political and geopolitical diversity? And the way we do it is by what I call internal cultural transformation and cross-cultural discourse. By that, I mean that advocates of human rights violations should start here and now at home. Today in the United States, what is the most serious and the most fundamental issue is the right of women to control their own bodies, the right of women to protect their own lives. And where is that in Texas today? Where is the rule of law? Where is the notion of universality, of constitutionalism? What's the notion of human decency in one of the largest and the most powerful states of the United States? And what can the federal government or the rest of the country do about it? So I'm thinking if we are to challenge ourselves, we should also start by challenging our own self truly, and then challenge everybody else that we feel have fallen up. At least we tried, and at least we are committed to these values. So that is the notion. The notion is what I call cultural transformation and political mobilization. That the rights of women, access to land. We had a project in 7 African countries, not all majority Muslims, but we looked at the issues of women access to land. 7 countries: Ethiopia, Somalia. No, Somalia was not, because it was too unstable. Nigeria, Ghana, Senegal, and so on. And we looked at closely to see. And by the way, we have this strange notion that if we pass a law, if we adopt a law, then the problem is solved. That is the most silly and naive notion. In fact, we pass laws precisely in order to avoid having to protect the rights in question. Because everybody says, look, we passed a law. When you go in that sort of global review by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and every 5 years or 6 years you come up and you say that we passed this law, we passed that law, we adopted that policy. But that has nothing to do with what's going on the ground in the country. So I think the point, I hope I'm not belaboring it too much, but the point is that Muslim majority countries are of course among the poorest because they are post-colonial, because we have surrendered our inner values and dignity and self-respect to appease our colonial powers, friends. The recent war in Yemen is very tragic. The civil war in Syria, the United States invasion and occupation of Iraq. But let me focus on the Muslim and Arab parts. I mean, those regions of the world that immediately come to mind when we talk. What about Palestinians? What about their fundamental human rights and so on? So the point is that we are not willing to stand by our values, even when they are indeed our values. And of course, everybody else will blame us for having failed to adopt other values, but at least let us do the values that we have, okay? I would stop with this and see if there are other questions, I hope.
And on that note, that is exactly why we're here today. This is why we have the Center for Security, Race and Rights. This is why we have the Desecuritizing Muslim Identity lecture series. And this is why we have Dr. Abdullahi and Naeem here to enlighten us, is because we are trying to be the change we seek, or the change we want to see. And if you are watching or listening or attending, I encourage you to support the Center for Security, Race and Rights through a donation, whatever you can afford. Go to csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate page. Your contribution directly affects how much we can do, how much work and impact we can have. And if this was something that you found beneficial for your own intellectual development, or you learned a tremendous amount and you'd like to see more, again, please do donate. In the meantime, other ways that we would appreciate your support is to follow us on social media, Instagram, Rutgers CSRR, Twitter, RUCSRR, TikTok, RUCSRR, and Facebook, RUCSRR. And also, please don't miss our upcoming lectures in this lecture series. We have Dr. Julianne Hammer coming on October 11th, and we have Professor Shireen Sinar coming on November 11th. And then in the spring, we already have lined up Maysoon Haroon, who wrote an excellent book called When We Were Arabs, The Forgotten History of Arab Jews in the Middle East. And we also have Dr. Edward Curtis IV, who will be talking about the history, his forthcoming book about Syrian and Lebanese Muslims and Arab and Christians in the US in the early 20th century, and kind of the history of Arab Americans in the country. And so we're very lucky to have all of these stellar experts to come and inform us. And today was a wonderful kickoff, a wonderful start to the lecture series. Thank you so much to Dr. Abdullahi and Naeem. We are so grateful for not just today, but everything you've written. MashaAllah, 70 plus articles and books. For those of us who are your biggest fans in academia, we will just try to be like you. And we'll try to be as prolific, as honest, as authentic, as truth seekers as you are. And you have really made an impact on so many hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of people throughout your career. And for that, we are very grateful. So assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much for your talk.
Wa alaikum assalam. Thank you. Thank you.